So welcome to the COVID-19 series of LBS Wheeler Institute for Business and Development. Today we are very pleased and honored, and I'm personally very happy to welcome my old friend Christopher Snyder joining us from Hanover, New Hampshire. Christopher is a professor of economics at Dartmouth College, and he's one of the world's leading scholars in microeconomics, in industrial organization. He has done very important work alongside with Mike Kramer on vaccines and on health treatments more generally. Chris, thanks a lot for taking the time. I understand that you're very busy trying to change the world for the better and also taking time to join us. So thanks a lot for being with us today.
Well, it's my pleasure. Happy to talk about my research passion, but also happy to be talking to my former colleague, whom we miss very much at Dartmouth.
Thanks, Chris. So I know that you have been pushing a lot with Jonathan Levin and Mike Kramer about this advanced market commitment idea with COVID-19. But I think it's important that we get all familiar with your work over the past couple of years. I recommend to our viewers to read your paper with Mike on why there is no vaccine for HIV. I know you have been working on these issues for a long time. So why don't you sketch the idea of advanced market commitments? And I know that you have been, that donors and the Gates Foundation, if I'm not mistaken, you have been doing a trial on some pneumococcal, which is actually quite relevant for COVID. So why don't you tell us about your past work, and then we go to COVID-19.
So the advanced market commitment was the brainchild of Michael Kramer. He described it in this book, Strong Medicine, that he wrote with his wife, Rachel Glenurster. And so the idea here was to try to incentivize the creation, the R&D and capacity investment in vaccines for neglected diseases for poor countries. So the point is that they're not very lucrative markets, so they need money to come in from donor agencies and donor countries. And the question is how to structure that. So the idea here was to provide some pull funding, so that's payment for vaccines that are actually produced. It's kind of an alternative to, say, a prize mechanism where you say you invent this new vaccine, or you invest in this capacity and we'll pay you for that invention. Here, the payment is made for the actual production, and in fact, it's tied to the number of doses that get administered. So it has some advantages. First of all, the idea is to pre-commit, to have the donors create this fund in advance of the investment that firms make. And what this does is it provides some security to the firms where they make these large investments. R&D can be hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars, and capacity investment could be a similar order. And you make those investments only to find out that then the purchasers say, well, tell us how much it costs you to produce a dose and we'll pay you that. And that fear, the lack of security, leads firms to underinvest in these things. So the idea here is to pre-commit to this fund in advance. It could be years in advance of the actual production. And so it's maybe put into an escrow account, and it's there for the firms. Any firm that actually makes the vaccine and invests in the capacity then can compete for the funds. But it's tied to the number of doses that eventually get sold or administered, and that has some advantages too. That way, donors can avoid paying for something that actually turns out not to be useful for the end users. You could imagine that there could be vaccines that meet target product profiles that turn out not to be that useful for the target audiences. So maybe that it requires some cold chain capacity that just doesn't exist in these developing countries. So by the advanced market commitment, typically involves some kind of co-payments that are made on the part of the end consumers. It could be, the countries, the consumers themselves, or maybe even a non-governmental organization on behalf of the countries. So it turns out that a vaccine or a product that's produced that's not all that useful for the end consumers, well, then they won't make the co-payments, and actually nothing actually gets paid because it doesn't get demanded. And so there's a feature of the program that in the end, the donors are only going to be paying for successful or useful products. In a sense, the co-payment is sort of a kill switch, where we're trying to come up with these contracts and this mechanism years in advance. We don't know what the eventualities are going to be. This provides kind of an out where if it turns out not to be that useful, given the situation that materializes years later, then we don't have to waste money on a useless product.
So, and my understanding is that now you have been testing this. There was a trial with a particular vaccine.
Michael's idea put forth with Rachel in this book, and we actually worked together on just the economics of vaccines. It turns out vaccines are just a really interesting product. They're quite different from any other product. So yes, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, now called Gavi, ran a pilot program, and they looked around and they said, what sort of disease should we run this for? They're thinking malaria, various other diseases. They eventually settled on pneumococcus, which I wasn't all that familiar with at the time. This is back in 2007. They started to put the program together. They settled on pneumococcus. The reason was that it was a little further along in the development cycle. So, they actually had a couple vaccines in phase 3 trials. So there wasn't as much uncertainty about whether, you can imagine you could incentivize lots of R&D, but if it's a hard scientific problem, even if you say triple or multiply by 10 the R&D that's going into the problem, if it's a really hard scientific problem, it still may not end up in a vaccine being produced. So this is kind of a closer to ultimate product. It was quite far along in clinical trials. The question there was more, could you incentivize the vast capacity investment that would be needed? They were thinking about having just a global campaign to vaccinate upwards of 200 million children every year. So kind of just having it as part of the childhood vaccination program. Now, pneumococcus, I wasn't aware, but it's actually the leading vaccine preventable killer of children under 5. So it was estimates of 800,000 deaths a year due to pneumococcus. Now, it turns out that in developed countries, you don't hear about it as much because we have readily available antibiotics that tends to, if you're diagnosed with this, you get the antibiotics, and it's only rare that it results in big health problems or mortality. But in poor countries where they have less access to antibiotics, it's a much bigger killer. So anyway, this was going to be the pilot program. And so they got a bunch of different committees together. I was part of, along with Michael Kramer and John Levin, part of the economics expert group, but there was a variety of people from academics and industry. Anyway, we designed the program. It turns out there were some wrinkles involved because there was a lot of money put forth. It was a $1.5 billion program, which in development economics, that's a lot of money. I mean, usually programs are funded with hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. Here we're talking 1.5 billion. And actually the ultimate program, when you included all the co-payments, was somewhere more around the order of $6 billion ultimately. So there were some issues about, you think that's a very lucrative program, but it turned out there were only 2 firms that had vaccines that were pretty far along in trials. So it wasn't like there were, dozens of different companies that could compete for this. It turned out there was really only a handful or maybe even fewer. So the question was, how do you design the particularities of the program for both, rather than a far-term product where you're trying to incentivize R&D. Here you're just trying to incentivize capacity. And not only that, if you didn't have a lot of potential participants, if you only had few, how would you adjust the mechanism? And so those are some of the issues we grappled with. And anyway, it was rolled out in 2009, I believe, and it's, by our estimates, we have this papers and proceedings paper in the American Economic Association papers and proceedings, where we kind of did a retrospective, thought about some of the theoretical principles and some of the lessons from our experience. And it seems, if you compare it to, say, other programs for rotavirus that were actually rolled out with quite a bit of funding behind them, but not structured as one of these advanced market commitments, it seemed like it accelerated the rollout by about 5 years. Now, it's only 2 experiments, so it's not a large amount of data, but that's kind of the best we can do with these large programs.
What I find fascinating reading your papers and proceedings that it seems a pilot, but it's so important, and the numbers are like so big of the kids that they were saved by bringing forward this vaccine by some years. It sounds like little, but it's a big thing. So
yeah, some estimates suggest that 700,000 children's lives were saved by the accelerating of the rollout of the vaccine.
So let's now go to, so I find it interesting that you were working on this issue and then suddenly, as I guess you were presenting at the American Economic Association meetings early January, COVID was unfolding. Actually, perhaps it was the time that it was arriving in the US, although it's politically heated debate when exactly did COVID arrive in the States. So now, can you please elaborate on the proposal that you have been pushing forward together with Jonathan Levin and Mike Kramer on how we can use this advanced commitments for COVID-19?
Sure, and I should say the team has grown in size. So before I say anything, here's the team. Susan Athey has joined from Stanford, and we have we have policymakers, economists, some grad students involved, Alex Tabarrok from George Mason University, and others. So just a lot of contributions here. And I can kind of, I showed you the slide before. So that was our experience up through the pneumococcal pilot, which stood to reason that Michael Kramer would be involved since it was his brainchild. Well, subsequently, of course, he won the Nobel Prize this year in economics for his work. A lot of his work with randomized controlled trials, actually, in development. In any event, you win the Nobel Prize and you have this idea of an advanced market commitment. People are going to find you and say, maybe this will work for the COVID vaccine. And that hits home because we, it's hitting both rich and poor countries. So the finance ministers start getting really interested in it. So various countries and agencies approached Michael. We actually wrote a New York Times piece with some preliminaries on a program that was more designed for the U.S. Because it was, the New York Times is a U.S. newspaper. But subsequently, we've talked to other countries, other agencies, and so we've actually expanded the program to an international program. And you can see this picture here. This is our what we call our Shiny app, where we have broadened it out, and we do some analyses for just basically a broad global international program. Anyway, so the basic, I call it basic economics for extraordinary times. There's really not rocket science behind the economics here, at least the basic ideas. But it is just such an unusual time that some of the ideas that they'll be ex post obvious, but you wouldn't necessarily be the first thought. So really three principles here behind the program. So the first is to go big. That I want to get across. It's going big, and it's such an unprecedented situation that it's hard to wrap your mind around how big we mean by big, and it leads to some new thinking. Another is the second point here, the need for market shaping. So we're not going to abandon the market. We're going to enlist firms to help. The countries are not going to be able to start doing R&D and all of a sudden create a vaccine industry on its own. We have to leverage that. But there's going to be some shaping involved. There's going to be some incentives that are needed to be added. And the final point is, we move from a U.S. proposal to an international proposal. There's lots of economic arguments that there are big gains from international cooperation here. So those are, I think, the three takeaway points I'd like to make. But as far as the basics of the proposal here, let me just give you some numbers. Really, when we talk to various policymakers and journalists and things, there's really one number, and that's from the IMF forecast of economic losses. So this is just economic output losses. This is not health and mortality. $9 trillion over the next 2 years, right? So just think about that for a minute. So what does that mean if you do the division by 9 trillion divided by 24 months? That's $375 billion that are just in economic losses alone that are lost every month that we are delayed reopening the economy because of the COVID crisis. And of course, that doesn't include the untold mortality, health, and quality of life costs. So those are the numbers. That's just an unprecedented gain if we can somehow end this crisis. Those are the benefits. So that actually changes your thinking. When the numbers are that big, then all of a sudden spending 10, 20, $100 billion to accelerate the arrival of vaccine, which may be our only hope to escape this quickly, all of a sudden become justified. All right, so here are some of the basics of our international proposal. We're actually, there is a lot of existing funding for R&D. If there are any reasonable candidates out there, and there are 80 or so, they're being funded by maybe the country itself or different vaccine authorities. So we'll leverage that, but on top of that, there's going to be, we're advocating additional monies that are invested in accelerating the investment of capacity. So this kind of harkens back to the pneumococcal pilot, where there it was incentivizing much greater capacity to serve the needs of poor countries. Here, we're recommending investing just an unprecedented amount in scaling up capacity and doing it quickly for vaccine candidates. So these numbers are subject to change. We're still doing some analysis, but the proposal as it stands now, we're talking about asking countries to spend this is not 17%, this is 0.17%. So basically 1/5 of 1% of their GDP, say in 2018, and that would amount to $147 billion. So what we're talking about is not spending, like your paltry aid budget or something. It's not as much as countries spend on their health budgets or their defense budgets, but it's somewhere in between those two numbers. What's this going to be used for? We're advocating investing in many different projects, 15 to 20 vaccine candidates. And what we're advocating is that capacity be built at risk, which means don't wait for phase 3 trials to finish. Start investing in huge capacity for these candidates in advance. And we're talking huge capacity here. When people talk about vaccine facilities, they have 100 million capacity to produce, say in a year, 100 million doses or something. Here, we're talking about building capacity for 1.5 billion courses within 3 months. We'd like that any of these candidates that turns out to be successful, try to accelerate the availability of these courses. So invest even while there's uncertainty about whether these candidates will actually turn out to be effective in the phase 3 trial tests. Why is that? That's because you can imagine that strategy is going to provide the best chance of accelerating the availability of this capacity by, say, 3 or 6 months. And even though some of this might be wasted, as we'll get to, because you invest in capacity and the candidate doesn't turn out, the probability of success is something like between 10 and 30% for these even promising candidates. So this is where things get unprecedented. The benefits are so large that it suggests this rather unprecedented investment where you don't wait, you invest early, and you invest at this large scale. And we can get into the details about push versus pull funding. I'm not sure if the audience knows those terms. We can define those terms later.
I really want to go to the push and the pull. I have many questions. So from a political economy standpoint, I think it's, I see the logic, but if you tell that we will spend, let's say, 50 billion, build capacity, build factories, and invest in machinery that will never be used, true, it sounds like a small number, a small share of GDP, but thinking about, supporting doctors, supporting nurses, building intensive care units. So even if we stay within, let's say, treatments, still it looks like a foregone.
Yeah, it's a good point.
It's a critique. Actually, I have been talking to friends here about your work, And this is immediately where I guess people are immediately going to the negatives.
Yeah, it's, I mean, in a sense, if you look at the benefits here, you know, the benefits are just so large that it dwarfs any of these costs. Now, you're right that we should think holistically about all of the different technologies. And in fact, our little group, we have a name. Let me just go back a couple slides. We call our group Accelerating HT. So we have a website and we've given ourselves a name. The HT stands for health technology. So we're thinking more holistically, not just about vaccines, but about treatments, about testing, about maybe advances in how clinical trials are conducted. So I agree, it shouldn't be an either or proposition. Certainly there should be tremendous investment in treatments, the you know, health systems, we need to be investing in those. But you know, if you think about how much is spent on health, you know, what's the percentage of a country's GDP spent on health? Here we're talking about a very tiny fraction of overall health spending. And you know, in a sense, people are going to be reluctant to go back to their ordinary lives, we think, until a vaccine is really kind of, in a sense, cures the whole pandemic.
Can you elaborate on the push and pull?
Sure. Let me go back to that. So by you know, push and pull, by push, we're talking about just you know, in general, funding for a project where what you do is you audit the company's books. The company says, you know, here's how much we spent, and it's kind of a cost plus funding. So this would be, you know, we spent say $20 million on clinical trials, and then here are receipts for what it cost us to, say, acquire this capacity. And then you know, you send the bill to the funder, and the funder pays that. So what we're saying is that actually push funding, if you can pull it off, if you can actually do that accounting, which is sometimes in question, then that's actually a very efficient way to move money to firms. And so we're saying, in a sense, do as much of that as possible. You want to leave firms with a little bit of skin in the game. So here we're advocating 15%. Of course, that number is, you know, we're not sure what the exact optimal number is, but 15% seems sufficient to provide firms with some skin in the game. That gives them incentives to actually make intelligent investments, and not just to have some, you know, fly-by-night firm say, hey, we got a good idea. They have to put in you know, a substantial amount of money themselves. And so some of the incentives then are coming from what's called pull funding. So 15% of the funding would be from pull. And that's basically the payment that would be made for the successful candidate. And what that's going to provide is, it's going to provide incentives to, you know, do intelligent investment that's directed toward a successful product, but it also will incentivize speed, because if there are several firms that might be the ultimate candidate, you know, if you're first in and you have the most successful product, then you're going to get the pull funding. So it turns out that the pull funding and then is, you know, the payment for the actual product that gets produced. But that pull funding, we're going to we're thinking about making it available to firms only if they're, say, investing the capacity that this is an extraordinary capacity at this large capacity amount that we're envisioning for, you know, a global vaccination campaign. But pull funding is expensive because you know, that's only paid conditional on success, and so, you know, yours has to be the best of the candidates ultimately if they're successful. Of course, as we were saying, there's sometimes only a, you know, 10 to 30% probability of success. So even if you're only risking 15% of the investment cost, if it's only paying off, you know, 1/5 of the time, you have to be promised a lot of money at the end for a successful product. So you can structure this pull funding in various ways. One way to structure it is you pay a lot for the initial doses, and then but then you build in that's kind of the reward, and then have a sort of a lower tail price, so closer to marginal cost pricing, and that way you can both reward the firm, but then not get this distortion from, too high prices. That way you can get, the marginal consumer can also afford the vaccine ultimately, as the pandemic unfolds.
Well, I know that one of your Go Big was the first, and then you also had Act Globally, Act with an international mindset, and actually having have to fly from Boston to Europe for this pandemic. There is actually a lot of transatlantic, I would say, debate even within Europe. If the vaccine, let's say, is found in Germany or in the UK, whether they're going to be preferential treatments. And we saw actually many countries, or a few countries, to be very selfish in the distribution of face masks, of ICU equipment. So can you please detail how you have been thinking about this issue?
Sure. Let's jump to this slide here. We're talking about the gains from international cooperation. We can get into some of the ideas here. This is four. You can probably think of several more on your own. I think one of probably the biggest, in my view, is the insurance value of exploring many candidates, right? So if each country explores its say single national champion with its pharmaceutical manufacturer that's located within its borders, that gives the country what they, in the soccer analogy, one shot on goal, right? Whereas it might be optimal to have, as we're talking about, 15 or 20 shots on goal. So what you'd rather do is, in a sense, buy insurance and get a piece of many shots on goal. Why is that? It has to do in part with the fact that vaccinating your vulnerable population is a lot of the value in vaccinations is with the vulnerable population. So these are people who experience the greatest mortality risk. These would be the aged population, and it's also the people most exposed to the virus. So this would be healthcare workers. So a lot of the benefits from vaccinating people in the country are concentrated in a small number of people. So that means that what you'd rather do is get an option on buying, a more certain option on vaccinating your vulnerable population than you would, say, a much less certain. So if you just have a single national champion, a 10 to 30% chance that this will work out, maybe you can take then the vaccine for all your people, but a lot of the benefits are concentrated in the vulnerable population. So pooling the risk and this insurance value, I think, is a huge benefit from international cooperation. There are other issues too, that if as a international collaboration, you can, rather than sort of scattershot picking different candidates, which might not be well coordinated, you can actually optimize the candidate portfolio. You can choose some that actually have, in a sense, aren't all in the same platform. And so there's some negative correlation. Why have 5 successful candidates, with a very small chance that are all on the same platform? Spread out the investment across multiple candidates. That actually maximizes the chance of getting a success. And according to our program, if you get a success, invested at that large capacity scale, can actually quickly vaccinate the world. But there are other issues too. There are international supply chain bottlenecks. Even if the manufacturer is actually in the country, the fill and finish, the ultimate fill and finish might be in a different country. It might be that certain inputs, like an adjuvant, you might need from, say, the UK, even though the actual vaccine is being produced in the US. And so it's really an international supply chain that we're talking about here. And international collaboration can actually potentially help free these bottlenecks. And another issue is too that you can avoid a bidding war if all the different countries are trying to procure it from themselves. Doesn't it make sense to sort of collaborate at the beginning? This is not trying to necessarily, we're talking about a large program, so it will be lucrative to firms, but it would avoid a sort of wasteful bidding war ex post. But your question was, that's the gain. So it kind of hints at why it would be that countries should collaborate rather than compete. But I think the big answer to your question is related to our programs, kind of maybe not an unanticipated consequence, but a nice side benefit or side effect of this huge capacity we're advocating, is that it really solves this sort of prisoner's dilemma problem that people are putting forward, this competition. and the point is that, it might be that any country individually, if they're just talking about their single national champion, they might have an incentive to fund capacity to vaccinate their own population. But we're advocating actually something closer to the world population in short order, right? So we're not saying capacity is sufficient to vaccinate the world population in 2 years. We're talking about, within months. And so there's a trade-off between capacity and time. The bigger the capacity, the more quickly, if you have twice as large a capacity, you can actually vaccinate the world twice as fast. So a huge capacity that we're advocating, actually, it goes a long way towards solving this problem of competing to be first in line. Basically, with this huge capacity, every country's vulnerable population could be vaccinated within a month or two. So there's no delay there. And in fact, it's the large capacity we're advocating is many other countries, even others, the not vulnerable population will start being vaccinated with very little delay, maybe a couple months. But that means there's less competition to be first in line. Let's say though that it's hard for the country, say Greece, it's invented in Greece. It's hard for Greece, to commit not to, say, vaccinating all of its citizens first. Let's take a bigger country. Let's take the U.S. We've done some analysis that suggests that even if the U.S. said, look, we signed this international agreement. We said we'd share it. All the vulnerable people get vaccinated first before our non-vulnerable citizens get vaccinated. Suppose the U.S. reneged on that agreement and said, no, we're going to take all of the first units to vaccinate our own people. I mean, it might slow down the rollout to everybody else by a week or two. If at the large capacities we're talking about, 1.5 billion doses in 2-month period. So there's really, it's less of a problem. It's more of a second order problem really, which, in a sense, if we say spend a month trying to refine the programs to avoid this vaccine nationalism, that actually would be a bigger cost than just saying, okay, we recognize that whatever country does the development, it has the manufacturing, okay, they're first in line, they can vaccinate everybody, and then it gets rolled out to the rest of the countries. Probably not, that would be a lower cost to the world.
I see. So I know that we're running out of time. But we have here at the Wheeler Institute of Business Development, actually our founders, Tony and Maureen Wheeler, founders of Land the Planet, who teach us so many things about our beautiful planet. So we are passionate about how businesses can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, as it's typically, for example, perceived in Africa or in many other low-income countries. Many would say even high-income countries. And here, this is an incentive scheme that would support pharmaceutical companies, which we come to realize that it's not that they have the best brand name to people. So, what do you think is going to be the role of businesses in helping in the COVID crisis?
Yes, that maybe go to this slide. I think that the role of business is vital here. As I hinted at in the first couple minutes of our talk, there's just not time to have countries, inventing a whole vaccine industry. These are a lot of the big players are commercial manufacturers, and they're going to be among the promising candidates here. And especially when you talk about scaling up capacity, they have just a lot of experience in probably the biggest capacities and the most experience in developing global supply chains. So it seems like a scheme that a mechanism that doesn't involve the commercial manufacturers and commercial pharmaceutical firms is not going to be as successful. So markets and commercial firms are going to be necessary here. The special nature of vaccines means that you can't just say the market's going to solve this on its own, and the special nature of this pandemic as well. So vaccines are just an unusual product. There's what economists call externalities. So the vaccination helps the herd as much as it helps the individual, and a lot of the consumer benefit may not be captured by the firm. And so governments realize this, and so the markets can just, often the governments buy vaccines on behalf of the citizens, and also agencies and insurers. Very few individuals go out and buy vaccines and inject themselves in their arms with the vaccine. So that we already have long experience with government involvement. Here, just the unprecedented need for size and speed means that, you know, commercial manufacturers, they will have an incentive to invest, but just not at the scale and the speed that we'd like. So there's going to have to be some shaping here. There's going to have to be some incentivization. There's going to have to be a collaboration really between world governments and private industry here. And neither one is the enemy of the other. There needs to be collaboration here.
Chris, thank you very much for taking the time. You are busy changing the world for better. So we understand how busy you are. Thanks a lot for taking the time and being with us today.
Elias, it was my pleasure. Happy to talk about a passion of mine, and you know, let's hope that we get this vaccine. But a true pleasure to participate.
Since you mentioned passion, next time we'll talk about basketball.
That's right.
You know, the best basketball player is Greek.
That's right, and people can't see because we're seated here, but we're both over 6'3", so we used to play basketball together.
Thank you.